Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Usually, when we talk about a legal document, like a last will and testament, for instance, there is this expectation of order.
Right. You write it down, get a witness, and that's that.
Yeah, and when the time comes, the estate is divided. I mean, it's a system built to prevent chaos. But then you look at 18th century European royalty, and that entire legal framework is just turned entirely inside out.
It really is. We have an inheritance dispute over a family estate that escalates into a conflict stretching from the snows of Bohemia all the way to the shores of India and the Americas.
And the sources we're using today lay out this entire conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession, spanning 1740 to 1748.
It's a complicated web of, legal disputes, royal ambitions, and global strategies.
And to you, listening right now, understanding this specific conflict is really the key to decoding the modern map of the world. I mean, the borders we recognize today, the strategies of empire, the entire concept of a global proxy war, it all crystallizes in this 8-year period.
To really get into it, we have to look at the origins, which expose how paper treaties were utilized as literal weapons.
Right.
We have to start with the death of Emperor Charles VI in October 1740. He was the head of the Habsburg monarchy, which is this sprawling collection of territories, often just collectively referred to as Austria.
And his death detonates a succession crisis that had been, well, meticulously, almost obsessively brewing for decades, right?
Definitely. And to grasp why his death caused such an immediate geopolitical earthquake, we actually have to rewind to a document drafted 37 years earlier.
Okay, lay it out for us.
It's the 1703 Mutual Pact of Succession.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that pact because it kind of sets the trap.
It does.
The Habsburgs are looking at their family tree, realizing they have a serious shortage of male heirs. So the 1703 pact provided that if the Habsburgs became extinct in the male line, their possessions would go first to the daughters of Emperor Joseph I.
Right. Those daughters were Maria Josepha and Maria Amalia.
And only after them would the inheritance pass to the daughters of Charles, who was Joseph's younger brother. I mean, it was an orderly contingency plan.
It was, until Joseph dies in 1711 and Charles takes over the empire. Now Charles is in power and, he decides he does not want his nieces inheriting the empire ahead of his own children.
Naturally, he wants to alter the contingency plan.
So in 1713, he issues a new decree called the Pragmatic Sanction. This document confirms the principle of female inheritance, which was necessary because the traditional Salic law strictly excluded women from inheriting land and titles.
I want to pause on Salic law for a second because this wasn't just some polite tradition. This was the bedrock of European land inheritance for centuries, tracing all the way back to the early Franks.
Oh, absolutely.
So Charles VI overturning it is akin to, like, a corporate CEO attempting to rewrite the foundational bylaws of a public company without shareholder approval. He's fundamentally changing the rules of succession to favor his own daughter, Maria Theresa.
Who was born a few years later in 1717.
Right, and he pushes her to the very front of the inheritance line, leapfrogging the daughters of his older brother.
Which creates a profound vulnerability for the Habsburgs. Prior to their marriages in 1719, both of Joseph's daughters were forced by Charles to formally renounce their rights to the inheritance.
Forced to sign it away.
Yeah. Maria Josepha married Frederick Augustus of Saxony, and Maria Amalia married Charles Albert of Bavaria. And Charles VI operated under this assumption that because Saxony and Bavaria were fierce regional rivals, neither would ever permit the other to inherit the Habsburg lands.
He thought their mutual jealousy would just cancel out any threat.
He really did.
That feels like a severe miscalculation. I mean, he's banking on the hatred between his rivals to protect his daughter. It's like a convoluted family trust where the patriarch changes the rules mid-game to favor his favorite child, assuming the disgruntled cousins will be too busy fighting each other to sue the estate.
That's a great way to put it.
But instead, the cousins look at the wealth on the table, decide to put their differences aside temporarily, and show up with standing armies.
He essentially handed his two greatest rivals a perfectly crafted legal pretext to claim the Habsburg lands. And Charles spent the entire remainder of his life and an exorbitant amount of diplomatic leverage trying to force the various Habsburg territories and the other European powers to sign off on this pragmatic sanction.
So he's trading real assets for signatures.
Yes, He offered trade concessions, he yielded territory, all just to get signatures on a piece of paper. He even tried to ensure Maria Theresa would succeed him to the title of Holy Roman Emperor.
Which was an elective position, right?
Right, held continuously by a Habsburg for over 300 years, but legally, it could not be held by a woman.
I have to challenge the premise that anyone actually cared about the signatures on the Pragmatic Sanction, though.
How so?
Well, the sources make it clear that the statesmen of Europe viewed these legal claims as pure theater. The true driver here was a tectonic shift in the geopolitical balance of power.
For sure. The legal claims were just a convenient excuse.
Right, because the size and military capability of Bavaria, Prussia, and Saxony had expanded significantly over the previous 50 years. And at the same time, the Habsburgs had expanded their own footprint after 1683, pushing deep into lands previously held by the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans.
The borders were expanding, rubbing up against each other, and creating intense friction. The powers of Europe were actively looking for a vulnerability to exploit, and Charles VI's death provided the perfect cover story.
The timing was everything.
It was. By 1738, France had already agreed to secretly back Bavaria's claims, despite having formally accepted the Pragmatic Sanction in 1735. Austria was bleeding financially and militarily from recent conflicts.
Right, specifically the War of the Polish Succession and a really disastrous Russo-Turkish War.
And added to that, the Habsburg court completely failed to educate Maria Theresa for her role.
That's the part that gets me. They didn't teach her statecraft, finance, or military strategy.
No, perhaps holding out hope for a male heir until the very end. So when Charles finally dies in October 1740, the consensus among European diplomats was that the Habsburg monarchy was on the verge of total collapse.
And while Maria Theresa's right to rule was being questioned on paper in the parlors of Paris and London, the debate was settled with gunpowder by a 28-year-old monarch who had just ascended to his own throne.
Frederick II of Prussia.
Yeah. He succeeds his father, Frederick William, in May 1740, and Frederick William was famously obsessed with building the Prussian military, right?
Obsessed is the right word.
So his son takes that inherited military machine and, by December of 1740, marches it straight into the wealthy Austrian province of Silesia. He doesn't even bother with a formal declaration of war. He just crosses the border.
Frederick recognized a fleeting geopolitical window. Prussia had grown in status, but its territories were geographically scattered across northern Europe. It was a very fragmented kingdom, which severely limited its capacity to project power.
And Silesia fixes that.
Oh, absolutely. Silesia was geographically contiguous to Prussia and incredibly prosperous. It boasted a population of over 1 million people, contained the commercial hub of Breslau, and possessed thriving mining, weaving, and dyeing industries.
So taking it would instantly transform Prussia's economy.
Overnight. Frederick also knew he had to strike fast before Augustus of Saxony and Poland could maneuver to take the province for himself.
Let's examine the mechanics of the armies involved here because the disparity is really telling. Austria has a population of 16 million and an authorized standing army on paper of 157,000 men.
But on paper is the key phrase there.
Right. Because of crippling financial constraints, the true number of deployable soldiers is vastly smaller. And since the Habsburg Empire is this patchwork quilt of territories stretching from modern-day Belgium to Romania, they have an impossibly long frontier to defend.
Their army operates more like a sieve than a shield.
Yeah, if you poke it in one place, the troops have to march for months from another province just to respond.
Contrast that structural weakness with Prussia. Prussia only has a population of 2.2 million people, a fraction of Austria's size. Yet they maintain a highly trained, permanently drilled standing army of 80,000 men.
Which is, what, roughly 4% of their entire population?
Yes, dedicated exclusively to the military profession. It was one of the highest militarization rates in Europe.
And Frederick had engaged in some highly cynical diplomacy behind the scenes, right?
Very cynical. He had secretly secured an agreement with King Louis XV of France back in April 1739. The understanding was that France would pressure Austria from the west, while Prussia attacked from the north.
Trapping the Habsburgs in an unwinnable two-front war.
Exactly.
The invasion itself is almost anticlimactic in its speed. In early December 1740, the Prussian army masses along the river Oder. On December 16th, they cross into Silesia.
And the Austrians are caught completely flat-footed.
Most of their military resources are tied up garrisoning Hungary and northern Italy. I mean, they have fewer than 3,000 troops in the entirety of Silesia when it starts.
They managed to bump that up to 7,000 just before the invasion, but it's a token force against the Prussian war machine.
So what did the Austrian commanders do?
They make the only logical choice available to them. They abandon the open province, garrison their troops in just three major fortresses, Glogau, Breslau, and Brieg, and withdraw the rest of their forces south into Moravia to wait out the winter.
So within 2 weeks, Prussia just swallows the richest province in the Holy Roman Empire with minimal casualties.
And Frederick assumes the war is essentially over.
Yeah.
He thinks Maria Theresa will negotiate to cut her losses, but he severely underestimates her resolve.
She refuses to yield.
She refuses. And because the Austrians still hold those three southern fortresses, Frederick can't claim a clean, uncontested victory. The conflict drags into the spring campaign season of 1741, which leads directly to the Battle of Mollwitz.
Right. And Mollwitz in April 1741 is a fascinating study in military failure and adaptation.
It really is.
An Austrian army under General von Neipperg marches north through the late spring snow to relieve the fortress of Neisse. On April 10th, the Austrians and Prussians clash. And this is Frederick's first time in command, right?
His very first battle.
Yeah.
And he makes a series of near-fatal tactical errors.
Walk us through the mechanics of those errors. Because the sources detail that the Prussian infantry was legendary, but their cavalry was a completely different story.
That's the crux of it. Frederick's father had poured all the kingdom's resources into the infantry, perfecting their drill and their speed of firing, but he largely neglected the cavalry.
So they're just not up to par.
At Mollwitz, the Prussian cavalry is poorly mounted, poorly trained, and hesitant. Meanwhile, the Austrian heavy cavalry, which is highly experienced from fighting the Ottomans, launches this ferocious charge and completely shatters the Prussian horsemen on the right flank.
The Prussian flank just collapses.
Completely.
The Austrian cavalry gets into the Prussian baggage train, and the situation disintegrates so rapidly that Frederick's own generals tell him the battle is lost and he needs to run to avoid being captured or killed.
And he actually does it.
That's the crazy part. The King of Prussia flees his very first battlefield on a fast horse.
He rides miles away from the fighting, genuinely believing his army has been annihilated. But back on the snowy field at Mollwitz, his deputy, Field Marshal von Schwerin, takes command of the situation.
And Schwerin leans on the one thing Prussia has that no one else does, right? The relentless discipline of the Prussian infantry.
Correct. The Prussian infantry lines hold their ground despite the absolute chaos around them. Their superior drill allows them to fire their flintlock muskets significantly faster than the Austrians.
So through sheer volume of fire and unyielding discipline, Schwerin pushes back the Austrian infantry and salvages a narrow, incredibly bloody victory.
Both sides suffer heavy casualties, losing nearly 5,000 men each.
I have to ask, if a monarch abandons his army in his debut battle, how does he end up with the moniker the Great?
It boils down to a rare capacity for self-criticism. Mollwitz was a humiliating personal failure for Frederick, but he didn't execute his generals or blame his troops.
He actually learned from it.
He used the subsequent lulls in the war to completely overhaul his cavalry. He recognized the mechanical flaws in his army and actively worked to correct them. However, while Frederick was learning how to be a commander, his survival at Mollwitz triggered a geopolitical avalanche.
Yeah, the sharks smell blood in the water. Mollwitz proves that the vaunted Austrian military can be beaten in the field by an upstart power. It exposes Austrian vulnerability and signals to the rest of Europe that the Habsburg Empire is ripe for carving up.
And things move fast. By the autumn of 1741, Maria Theresa's position deteriorates from precarious to dire.
Because in June, Frederick signs a formal treaty with France, openly allying against Austria.
Right, and by August, a combined Franco-Bavarian force crosses the frontier, marching along the Danube on a direct path toward Vienna. They capture the city of Linz in mid-September.
Then, joined by 20,000 Saxon troops, the Franco-Bavarian army pivots. Instead of continuing to Vienna, they advance north on Prague from 3 different directions, encountering virtually no organized resistance.
The Austrian defensive strategy was just in tatters at this point. General Neipperg had to be urgently recalled from Silesia to defend the approaches to Vienna, which left Silesia entirely in Prussian hands.
So they're completely exposed.
A hastily assembled Austrian army gathered near Tabor in Bohemia, but it was incredibly disorganized. Maria Theresa faced the imminent loss of both her capital and her crown.
She responds with a piece of political theater that really secures her legacy. On September 21st, 1741, she travels to the Diet of Hungary in Pressburg.
And for context, the Diet is the legislative assembly of the Hungarian nobility.
Historically, the Hungarians have had a very tense, often rebellious relationship with their Habsburg rulers in Vienna. So going to them is a risk.
It is, but she understands the psychology of the Hungarian nobility. She appears before the Diet holding her infant son, Joseph. She makes a highly emotional, desperate appeal to their chivalry and their loyalty, asking them to raise additional troops to defend her from the foreign invaders tearing her empire apart.
And it actually works.
It does.
The Hungarian nobles, moved by the appeal and probably realizing that a weak Habsburg monarch in Vienna is better for their own autonomy than a powerful Bavarian or French ruler, agree to provide a crucial lifeline of military resources and manpower.
But her survival isn't just down to Hungarian troops. It's heavily aided by the intense paranoia and duplicity among her enemies.
We have to look at Frederick's calculations here. He wants Alicia. He has it. What he does not want is for his allies, specifically the Saxons and the Bavarians, to become too powerful by conquering Bohemia.
Right. If Saxony takes Bohemia, Prussia is suddenly bordered by a massive, wealthy rival.
So Frederick decides to undercut his own alliance.
On October 9th, 1741, Frederick signs a secret truce with the Austrian general Neipperg. It's called the Klein-Schnellendorf Agreement.
This secret pact is the ultimate distillation of 18th century cabinet diplomacy. It's a game of calculated double-crossing, where treaties are just temporary alignments of convenience.
Under this agreement, the Austrians and Prussians decide to stage a fake siege of the fortress of Nice to fool the rest of Europe into thinking they are still fighting.
A fake siege. We need to drill into the mechanics of this because it sounds completely absurd to modern ears. How do two armies pretend to fight a siege?
Well, siege warfare in the 18th century was highly formalized. It was less about brute force and more about applied mathematics and engineering.
Like a script.
Yes. You follow a strict sequence. You surround the fortress, you dig a series of parallel trench lines, you slowly advance your artillery, and you calculate the exact angles to breach the masonry walls. The rules of war dictated that if a besieging army demonstrated they could breach the wall, the defending garrison could surrender with honor before the final bloody assault took place.
So at Nice, the Prussians and Austrians just go through the choreography.
Exactly.
The Prussians dig the trenches, they move the cannons, they wait a predetermined number of days, and then the Austrian garrison intentionally runs up the white flag, having never been in actual danger.
And by surrendering under those specific formal conditions, the garrison is granted the honors of war. This meant they weren't taken prisoner. They were allowed to march out of the fortress with their weapons, their flags flying, and were granted unimpeded passage to the nearest friendly territory.
The brilliance of this is staggering. I mean, by faking a defeat, the Austrian commander effectively frees up his own troops, who were stuck in a fortress, to go march west and fight Prussia's allies.
While Frederick gets to keep his grip on Silesia without spending any more Prussian blood, he just sits back and watches his French and Bavarian allies exhaust themselves fighting the newly reinforced Austrians.
So cynical, but so effective.
The Austrian forces released from Nice were immediately incorporated by General von Khevenhuller into a new army for a winter offensive. His objective was clear: retake Upper Austria and launch a punitive strike directly into Bavaria.
While Austria and Prussia are executing this elaborate, cynical dance in Central Europe, the scope of the war violently expands, right?
Yes, France officially enters the conflict, sending troops to back Bavaria's claim.
And this draws Great Britain into the fray, bringing us to a clash of grand strategies between the two major global powers.
The War of the Austrian Succession is really three overlapping conflicts. You have the Silesian Wars between Prussia and Austria over territory. You have the campaigns in northern Italy, where Austria and Sardinia are fighting the Spanish over dynastic claims.
And encompassing all of it, you have the escalating global struggle for supremacy between Britain and France.
Their approaches to this war were diametrically opposed.
Let's examine the French strategy first. France's military doctrine was entirely fixated on the European continent. They believed their primary security threat came from their eastern and northern land borders.
Therefore, they maintained a really large, incredibly expensive standing land army.
Yeah.
But maintaining that army meant they chronically underfunded their navy.
So their overseas colonies in North America and India were largely left to fend for themselves, with minimal support from Paris.
The prevailing theory in the French court was that any colonial losses suffered overseas could be easily rectified at the peace table. They believed that if they conquered rich territories in Europe, like the Austrian Netherlands, they could simply trade those European conquests back to the British in exchange for whatever colonial outposts they had lost during the fighting.
I'm going to push back on the idea that this was just a foolish oversight by the French. Let's look at the geopolitical reality here. France is physically attached to the European continent, surrounded by potential hostile powers. Britain is an island. Britain can afford to ignore a large standing army because they have the English Channel as a moat. For France, prioritizing the continent over colonies is not a failure of imagination. It's an absolute geographic necessity.
That's a fair assessment.
Plus, the French know they can't outbuild the British Royal Navy. Any money they pour into a fleet is likely going to end up at the bottom of the ocean.
You're identifying the core constraints of French policy. It was a geographic necessity, but it also became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because they underfunded the Navy, they couldn't reliably supply their colonies, making those colonies highly vulnerable to British naval operations.
Which brings us to the British strategy, which operates on entirely different financial mechanics. Britain avoids committing its own citizens to large-scale land armies on the continent.
Instead, they leveraged the Bank of England and their sophisticated system of national credit to generate immense wealth.
And they use that wealth to pay subsidies, essentially giant piles of cash, to allies like Austria, Hanover, and various German mercenary states, paying them to fight the French on land.
Britain bankrolls the Continental War to tie down the French army. While the French are bogged down in muddy sieges in Flanders and Bohemia, Britain unleashes the Royal Navy.
They utilize a dual-pronged approach, right?
Yes. They enforce naval blockades to choke off French trade and customs revenue, and they launch targeted amphibious assaults against vulnerable French and Spanish colonies worldwide, often mobilizing local colonial militias to do the heavy lifting.
This strategy ensures the war bleeds out of Europe and into the wider world. But the European battlefields still saw profound political drama, particularly in the period between 1742 and 1744.
Early in 1742, the political architecture of Europe shifts. The Bavarian elector, Charles Albert, achieves his ultimate ambition. He is crowned Emperor Charles VII.
This is a monumental rupture in tradition. He is the first non-Habsburg to hold the title of Holy Roman Emperor in 3 centuries.
Yet the coronation is a bitter irony.
Because on the exact same day he's receiving the crown, the revitalized Austrian army, heavily funded by British gold, marches into Bavaria and captures his own capital city of Munich.
His imperial title is completely hollow. He is an emperor without a homeland.
The anti-Habsburg alliance was rapidly fracturing. Prussia, Saxony, and Bavaria were nominally united, but deep mistrust defined their relationship. None of them wanted France to gain a permanent foothold in the German states, and they certainly didn't want their regional rivals to grow too strong.
Maria Theresa recognizes this paranoia and exploits it brilliantly. She takes the details of the secret Klein-Schnellendorf agreement.
The truce where Frederick agreed to the fake siege of Nice.
Right, that one. And she leaks the documents to the rest of the European courts. She publicly exposes Frederick's double dealing.
Releasing those details just destroys whatever trust remained between Frederick and his allies.
The newly crowned emperor, Charles VII, is desperate. Munich has fallen. He pleads with Frederick to relieve the pressure on Bavaria by launching an invasion of Moravia to distract the Austrians.
And Frederick, realizing his diplomatic isolation, obliges, leading to the Battle of Chodusitz in May 1742.
This battle is a critical test for Frederick. He had spent the winter retraining his cavalry after their humiliating collapse at Mollwitz. At Chodusitz, he fields an army of about 28,000 men.
The battle is fought near a small Bohemian village, and the mechanics of the fight are brutal. While technically inconclusive because the Austrians execute an orderly withdrawal, the strategic result is significant.
The Prussian army remains intact and poses a direct existential threat to Vienna.
The overarching Habsburg strategy was always to avoid fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously.
And Prussia was, without question, their most lethal opponent.
So Maria Theresa makes the cold, pragmatic calculation to accept a temporary territorial loss in order to focus her forces on her weaker enemies, Bavaria and France.
In June 1742, Austria and Prussia signed the Treaty of Breslau, formally ending the First Silesian War. Prussia withdraws its forces from Bohemia, but is allowed to keep Silesia.
With Prussia sidelined, Austria focuses its military might and recaptures Prague by December.
With Prussia temporarily pacified, the center of gravity shifts to the pragmatic army.
This was a coalition force comprised of British, Hanoverian, and Austrian troops, funded by Britain and tasked with defending the Austrian Netherlands and Hanover from French incursions.
In June 1743, this pragmatic army is maneuvering toward a supply depot at Hanau. Their path is abruptly blocked by a French army of 23,000 men near a village called Dettingen.
The Battle of Dettingen holds a unique place in history because the Pragmatic Army was personally commanded on the battlefield by King George II of Great Britain.
It's a striking image. The British monarch is physically present on the field, directing troops under fire.
The French have secured a formidable defensive position blocking the Allied line of retreat, but the French commander on the ground, the Duke of Gramont, disobeys orders.
He does. He leaves his secure position and attacks the Allied lines prematurely across restricted terrain.
Gramont's unforced tactical error allows the Allied infantry, particularly the disciplined British and Hanoverian regiments, to unleash devastating volley fire into the advancing French columns.
The French assault is shattered, and the Pragmatic Army secures a narrow, crucial victory. Dettingen goes down in history as the final time a reigning British monarch personally led troops into combat.
While George II is winning on the battlefield, Frederick of Prussia is watching the geopolitical weather change. Austria is winning victories and consolidating power.
Frederick realizes his hold on Silesia is only as strong as his army, and he knows Maria Theresa will eventually come back for it.
So he begins frantically searching for allies, which pulls us into a dark, intricate diplomatic scandal known as the Botta Conspiracy.
The Botta Conspiracy illustrates how far these powers would go to manipulate the geopolitical chessboard. In July 1743, rumors begin circulating in the Russian court in St. Petersburg of an alleged plot to overthrow Empress Elizabeth and restore a young boy, Ivan VI, to the throne.
We need to explain the factions here. The Russian Chancellor Bestuzhev-Ryumin is fiercely anti-Prussian and favors an alliance with Austria and Britain.
Frederick of Prussia desperately needs Bestuzhev-Ryumin removed from power so he can isolate Austria from Russian support.
The historical consensus is that Frederick and his agents entirely fabricated the rumors of this coup to frame the Chancellor's allies.
The methods used by the Russian court to investigate this fabricated plot were horrific. According to our sources, Anna Bestuzhev, the sister-in-law of the Chancellor, and her friend Natalia Lopukina were arrested.
They were subjected to 25 days of continuous torture on the rack.
Eventually, broken by the pain, they confessed to a plot that likely never existed.
The punishments handed down were savage, even for the era. The women were publicly flogged with the knout, their tongues were cut out to prevent them from ever recanting their confessions, and they were permanently exiled to the frozen wastes of Siberia.
Frederick's diplomatic agents capitalized on this brutality. They actively propagated the narrative that an Austrian envoy, Antonio Botta Adorno, was the mastermind behind the alleged plot.
And Empress Elizabeth, furious at the supposed betrayal, demanded that Maria Theresa severely punish Botta.
Maria Theresa, recognizing the obvious Prussian manipulation, outright refuses to punish her envoy. The result is exactly what Frederick engineered.
Even if the plot was a total fabrication built on tortured confessions, the diplomatic fallout is real.
Very real. The relationship between Austria and Russia is severely poisoned, ensuring Austria will not have Russian military support in the coming years.
Frederick's machinations ensure Austria remains isolated in the east, setting the perfect stage for the tides of war to turn violently again in 1744 and 1745.
The web of alliances rearranges itself once more. Early in 1744, France and Spain negotiate a secret treaty for joint military action against Britain.
Their plan is audacious. A full-scale amphibious invasion of Britain designed to overthrow the Hanoverian monarchy and restore the exiled Catholic Stuarts to the throne.
King Louis XV commits significant resources to the operation. He assembles 12,000 battle-hardened French troops and a massive fleet of transport ships at the port of Dunkirk over the winter.
But military operations in the 18th century were entirely subordinate to the weather.
The English Channel has historically protected Britain from invasion, and it does so again. Severe winter storms batter the French coast, sinking transports and heavily damaging the escort warships.
The logistical nightmare of repairing the fleet, combined with deep skepticism from Louis's ministers who view the invasion as a huge waste of funds, leads to the entire operation being canceled in March 1744.
With the invasion aborted, France formally declares war on Britain and pivots its army to invade the Austrian Netherlands.
This draws the bulk of the Austrian military westward to defend their territories against the French onslaught. Frederick, observing from Berlin, sees his opportunity. The Austrian homeland is stripped of its defenders.
In August 1744, Frederick strikes, launching the Second Silesian War. He pours an army of 80,000 men directly into Bohemia heading straight for Prague.
The Austrian high command is caught completely off balance. Prince Charles of Lorraine is forced to immediately disengage his army from the French border and execute a desperate, forced march back across Germany to defend Bohemia.
Here is where the fragility of an absolute monarchy becomes glaringly obvious.
Prince Charles is able to disengage and march east with almost no interference from the large French army in front of him. Why? Because the King of France, Louis XV, falls dangerously ill with smallpox in the city of Metz.
In a system where the monarch is the sole source of authority, his incapacitation paralyzes the entire chain of command. The French generals, terrified of making a strategic error without the king's explicit orders, refuse to pursue the retreating Austrians.
The French army just stops. Instead of chasing the Austrians and supporting their Prussian ally, they sit down and besiege the minor town of Freiburg.
Freiburg is of zero strategic value to Maria Theresa compared to the defense of her homeland in Bohemia.
Frederick finds himself dangerously exposed. He had invaded Bohemia, operating on the assumption that the French would tie down the Austrian army in the west.
Instead, the Austrians, reinforced by a Saxon army, march into Bohemia and systematically cut off Frederick's supply lines.
We have to talk about the reality of an 18th century retreat. Frederick's army is starved of supplies. They are harassed by light cavalry. By the time the Prussian army finally retreats back across the border into Silesia in late November, the conditions are catastrophic.
He loses over 40,000 men. Half of those casualties are not from Austrian bullets, but from dysentery and starvation.
Frederick's strategic position at the close of 1744 was incredibly fragile, but the geopolitical landscape fractures again in early 1745. On January 20th, Emperor Charles VII, the Bavarian elector who had usurped the imperial title, dies.
His death removes the primary political obstacle for Maria Theresa. Her husband, Grand Duke Francis, immediately becomes the leading candidate for the imperial throne.
The new Bavarian elector attempts one final, desperate military campaign against the Austrians, but his forces are decisively crushed.
Recognizing reality, he signs a peace treaty with Austria, formally abandons his claims, and pledges his electoral vote to Francis.
With Bavaria neutralized and out of the conflict, France shifts its entire strategic focus to the Low Countries.
The brilliant French commander, Maurice de Saxe, convinces Louis XV that conquering the Austrian Netherlands is the most effective way to defeat Britain, who is bankrolling the entire Allied war effort.
Saxe is a master of positional warfare. He lays siege to the vital fortress of Tournai. He knows the Allied army, commanded by the Duke of Cumberland, will be forced to march to its relief.
Saxe intentionally draws the Allies into a set-piece battle on terrain he has meticulously prepared.
This results in the Battle of Fontenoy on May 11, 1745. Fontenoy is a grueling, complex infantry engagement.
Detail the climax of Fontenoy for us. The British infantry forms into this really dense column of over 10,000 men and slowly advances straight into the center of the French lines.
It's a terrifying display of discipline, absorbing artillery fire and continuing to march forward, threatening to split the French army in half.
The British column penetrates deep into the French position. But Saxe, directing the battle from a wicker carriage because he is suffering from severe dropsy, coordinates a huge counterattack.
He unleashes the French reserves, including the famed Irish Brigade, alongside point-blank artillery fire, which finally breaks the British column and forces them into a bloody retreat.
Fontenoy is a decisive French victory that shatters Allied control of the Netherlands.
Meanwhile, back in Central Europe, Frederick manages to pull off a stunning reversal. Despite his battered army, he lures the Austrians into a trap and wins a decisive victory at Hohenfriedberg on June 4th.
Following that victory, Francis I is officially elected Holy Roman Emperor in September, fulfilling Maria Theresa's primary political objective.
And then, in December 1745, after his forces win another crucial battle at Kesselsdorf, Frederick executes his signature diplomatic move. He signs the Treaty of Dresden.
Austria begrudgingly accepts the permanent loss of Silesia. Saxony is forced to pay a heavy financial indemnity to Prussia, and Frederick formally acknowledges Francis as emperor before immediately exiting the war.
Once again, Frederick secures his specific state objectives and instantly abandons his French allies without hesitation.
Let's examine this pattern. Frederick signs the Treaty of Breslau, leaves the French in the lurch. He signs the Treaty of Dresden, leaves the French in the lurch.
What does this repeated betrayal reveal about the concept of national loyalty in this era?
It reveals that in the era of cabinet warfare, loyalty was a fiction. Treaties were not viewed as sacred bonds between nations or peoples. They were temporary contracts between monarchs.
Frederick understood a fundamental reality. Prussia's specific state interest was holding Silesia. He had no intention of bleeding his army dry merely to assist France in conquering territory in Flanders.
Loyalty was entirely subordinate to the survival and expansion of the state.
While the major European powers are exhausting themselves playing this cynical, bloody Game of Thrones on the continent, the conflict spills over into their overseas colonies. The proxies of these empires are fundamentally redrawing the map across the oceans.
We're shifting our focus to the global theaters, starting with North America and then moving to India.
In North America, the conflict is referred to by the British colonists as King George's War. Unlike the massive set-piece battles in Europe, this theater was characterized primarily by frequent, brutal, small-scale raids along the heavily forested frontiers between New France and the British colonies of New England and New York.
These raids usually involved French colonial troops and their Native American allies targeting isolated British settlements.
But amidst the frontier skirmishing, there is one major conventional military operation that alters the strategic balance. The British colonists organize an ambitious expedition to capture the French fortress of Louisbourg.
Louisbourg, located on Cape Breton Island, was a vital strategic stronghold for France. It guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, acting as the gateway to French Canada.
Furthermore, it served as a heavily fortified base for French privateers who were wreaking havoc on the New England fishing fleets and merchant shipping.
The expedition is a logistical marvel for the colonies. It's organized by Massachusetts Governor William Shirley and commanded by William Pepperell, a merchant with almost no formal military experience.
They raise a force of over 4,000 colonial militia and coordinate a blockade with a Royal Navy fleet.
Between April and June of 1745, this ragtag colonial militia successfully lays siege to one of the most formidable fortresses in North America. They drag artillery through swamps, establish siege batteries, and eventually force the French garrison to surrender.
For the British colonists, the capture of Louisbourg is a monumental triumph. They feel they have eliminated a major economic and physical threat through their own blood and treasure.
Keep their pride in this victory in mind, because how the diplomats in Europe handle Louisbourg at the end of the war is going to generate intense, long-lasting resentment.
But now let's travel across the globe to India, where the First Carnatic War is unfolding.
The First Carnatic War marks the true inception of the violent struggle between Britain and France for dominance over the Indian subcontinent. Prior to this, the European presence in India was primarily managed by trading companies, the British East India Company and the French East India Company.
They were focused on commerce, operating out of coastal enclaves with permission from local Indian rulers.
The hostilities escalate when a French naval squadron arrives on the coast, commanded by Mahe de la Bourdonnais. In September 1746, he lands troops near Madras, which is the principal British commercial settlement in the Carnatic region.
The condition of Madras is a perfect indicator of how unprepared the companies were for war. The fortifications were dilapidated, and the garrison was small. The British governor surrendered the port to Bourdonnais after just a brief 6-day bombardment.
But the French victory is immediately undermined by bitter internal politics. Bourdonnais, acting as a naval commander seeking a profit, agrees to terms of surrender that allow the British East India Company to ransom the settlement of Madras back for a substantial cash payment.
The French Governor-General of India, Joseph-François Dupleix, is furious. Dupleix operates with a broader imperial vision. He wants to permanently eradicate British influence in the region, not just collect a ransom. He vehemently opposes the concession.
Nature intervenes in October. A powerful cyclone strikes the coast, devastating the French naval squadron. Bourdonnais loses several ships and is forced to sail away to refit.
With his rival gone, Dupleix simply rips up the ransom agreement, expels the British merchants, and claims Madras permanently for France.
Dupleix's blatant disregard for the treaty draws the ire of the local Indian sovereign, the Nawab of the Carnatic, Anwaruddin Muhammad Khan. The Nawab viewed the European settlements as his subject.
He intervenes, demands the French return Madras to the British, and sends his own army of 10,000 men to forcefully retake the city.
This leads directly to the Battle of Adyar in October 1746. We need to dissect the mechanics of this battle because it changes the course of global history.
You have a French force of roughly 1,000 men, mostly Indian sepoys trained in European tactics, along with a few hundred European regulars. They are facing 10,000 of the Nawab's troops, primarily traditional Indian cavalry.
The Nawab's army relies on the historical shock value of a mass cavalry charge to break the enemy, but the French force utilizes disciplined volley fire.
Explain how that volley fire actually functions against a cavalry charge. We're talking about the flintlock musket and the socket bayonet.
A flintlock musket takes roughly 20 seconds to reload. If every man fires at once, you have a 20-second window where the infantry is defenseless, which is more than enough time for charging cavalry to close the distance and slaughter them.
To counter this, the French troops are drilled to fire by ranks or platoons. One line fires, the next line steps up and fires while the first line reloads.
It creates a continuous rolling wall of lead, and if the cavalry somehow survives the gunfire and reaches the line, they are met with a wall of socket bayonets, turning the infantry formation into an impenetrable spear wall.
At the Battle of Edior, the disciplined firepower of the small French infantry force completely shatters the large, traditional Indian cavalry charge.
Why is this single engagement so vital?
Because it's the first undeniable demonstration of the acute gap in military technology, discipline, and tactical organization that had opened up between European armies and traditional Indian forces.
It proved to commanders like Dupleix that small, highly trained European forces could easily defeat much larger local armies. This realization sets the precedent for aggressive European military intervention in local Indian politics, paving the way for eventual colonial conquest.
The British eventually launch a counterattack in India. Admiral Edward Boscawen arrives with a large naval squadron and regular troops. He lays siege to the main French settlement of Pondicherry.
But Dupleix has heavily fortified the city, and after 2 months of grinding siege warfare, the British are forced to abandon the effort. The land war in India grinds to a stalemate, making it clear that dominance relies entirely on controlling the sea lanes.
Which transitions us directly into the concurrent naval war that had been raging since 1739, a conflict famously known as the War of Jenkins's Ear.
The War of Jenkins's Ear. It begins over long-standing bitter disputes between Britain and Spain regarding smuggling and conflicting territorial claims in the Americas. It's essentially a trade dispute that escalates into a naval war, which then merges seamlessly into the wider War of the Austrian Succession.
The British grand strategy was to cripple the Spanish Empire by launching combined naval and amphibious operations against key Spanish ports from both the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts.
Admiral Edward Vernon commands the eastern thrust into the Caribbean. He scores an early, highly publicized success in November 1739 by capturing the poorly defended Spanish harbor of Portobello, located in present-day Panama.
That early victory leads to fatal overconfidence in London. Vernon is reinforced with a large fleet of over 100 ships and a large body of land troops, including colonial American militia. Their target is the heavily fortified Spanish port of Cartagena de Indias in modern-day Colombia in the spring of 1741.
The assault on Cartagena is a masterclass in military failure. The Spanish defenders, commanded by Blas de Leso, conduct a brilliant elastic defense. They fall back from outer fortifications, forcing the British to slowly slog through the dense jungle and establish siege lines in the oppressive heat.
As the British army sits in the swamps outside the city walls for 2 months, they are decimated not by Spanish bullets, but by tropical diseases, primarily yellow fever.
The logistics of the expedition completely collapse. The naval commanders and the army commanders refuse to cooperate. The troops are drinking stagnant water. The mortality rate is staggering.
The British are forced to abandon the siege, having suffered catastrophic losses of both men and ships to disease. It is a profound logistical disaster.
While Vernon's large fleet was dying of yellow fever in the Caribbean, the western component of the British strategy was underway. Commodore George Anson was tasked with sailing a small squadron around Cape Horn to attack the Pacific coast of South America and disrupt Spanish silver shipments.
Anson's expedition is the stuff of nautical nightmares. He leaves Britain in September 1740 with a squadron of 6 ships. The voyage is immediately plagued by delays, horrific weather trying to round the Horn, and a devastating outbreak of scurvy.
We need to explain the terror of scurvy in the 18th century. The medical establishment did not yet understand that it was caused by a simple deficiency of vitamin C.
The biological reality of scurvy is horrifying. Your connective tissue begins to break down, the crew's teeth fall out, their gums rot, old, healed wounds suddenly split open and begin bleeding again. Men simply collapse on the deck and die from internal hemorrhaging.
Anson's crew is decimated by the disease. By the time he crosses the Pacific and reaches the coast of China, he has lost hundreds of men. By June 1744, when he finally returns to Britain after 4 years at sea, he only has his flagship left, the Centurion.
Every other vessel in his squadron has either sunk, been abandoned, or forced to turn back.
It's the ultimate analogy for a catastrophic expedition. Everything goes wrong, the weather fights you, your crew dies of a mysterious plague, your ships rot beneath you, but then right in the very end, you stumble upon a winning lottery ticket.
The lottery ticket being the capture of a Spanish treasure galleon.
Exactly. Despite having only one battered ship and a skeletal crew left, Anson intercepts the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Covadonga off the coast of the Philippines. It is loaded with over 1 million pieces of eight.
Anson captures immense wealth and completely circumnavigates the globe in the process. He returns home a hero, but strategically, the naval war across the globe is largely characterized by this kind of privateering, disrupting commerce, and capturing prizes rather than engaging in decisive fleet actions that alter the course of the war.
Before we analyze how this sprawling global conflict finally came to a close, we need to pause and examine the physical mechanics of how it was fought on the ground in Europe. We've discussed treaties and grand strategies, but what defined an 18th century battlefield?
The historical sources frequently refer to this era of conflict as a cabinet war. Let's define that term. What does a cabinet war actually entail?
A cabinet war, or Kabinettskrieg, refers to a conflict where highly disciplined regular armies are equipped, supplied, and directed entirely by the state apparatus to fight for the specific, calculated interests of the sovereign, the monarch's cabinet.
This is in stark contrast to the wars of religion in the previous century, which were driven by ideological fervor, or the total wars of the 20th century involving mass conscription.
The armies themselves are built around massed infantry. The primary weapon is the smooth-bore flintlock musket, equipped with a socket bayonet.
The tactics reflect the technology. The smoothbore musket is highly inaccurate beyond 50 yards. To maximize damage, infantrymen are drilled relentlessly to stand shoulder to shoulder in long lines and fire synchronized volleys.
It's lines of men standing in open fields, trading sheets of lead at close range.
Supporting the infantry is the cavalry. Light cavalry, like hussars, are utilized primarily for reconnaissance, foraging, and screening the army's movements from enemy scouts.
Heavy cavalry, like cuirassiers, are held in reserve to deliver devastating shock charges intended to break the enemy infantry lines once they are weakened by musket fire.
Artillery provides fire support on the battlefield, but the sources indicate its most crucial role was in siege warfare. Strategic movement in this era centered entirely around controlling key fortresses that commanded the road networks and river crossings. If you control the fortresses, you control the region.
And the absolute defining constraint on all these operations is logistics.
This is a crucial point. Armies in the 1740s have grown significantly larger than in previous eras. You can no longer sustain an army of 50,000 men simply by foraging and plundering the local countryside. They would starve in a week.
They require centralized supply depots, known as magazines, and incredibly vulnerable, slow-moving baggage trains to transport bread and powder to the front.
Because of the difficulty of moving heavy supply wagons over unpaved, muddy roads, continuous military operations are impossible for half the year. When the autumn rains arrive and the roads turn to soup, armies are forced to cease operations and go into winter quarters until the ground dries in the spring.
I have to challenge the term cabinet war, though. The phrasing makes it sound orderly, civilized, almost like a sterile chess match played by gentlemen in powdered wigs. Doesn't that reputation for being a controlled conflict completely sanitize the grim, horrifying reality for the common soldier?
We just discussed Frederick losing 20,000 men to dysentery on a retreat, and the British fleet being wiped out by yellow fever at Cartagena.
You're raising a vital distinction.
Yeah.
The term cabinet war describes the political control and the limited objectives of the conflict. It does not describe the human experience on the ground. It is true that compared to the widespread intentional massacres of civilians during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, this era was more restrained. Armies generally tried to avoid burning down the tax base.
But for the soldier, it's a meat grinder.
Absolutely. The casualty rates in battles like Fontenoy or Mollwitz were staggering. And disease was a far more lethal enemy than enemy fire. The logistical failures meant that starvation and exposure were constant threats.
The orderly, seasonal approach to warfare going into winter quarters did not save lives. It merely prolonged the suffering over 8 years and systematically drained the treasuries of Europe.
Which provides the perfect transition to the end of the war. By 1748, the powers of Europe have bled their treasuries dry. The military stalemate and the financial exhaustion force everyone to the negotiating table, resulting in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in October 1748.
The primary catalyst for peace was imminent financial collapse. France, despite winning victories on land in the Netherlands, was teetering on the brink of total economic ruin. The British naval blockade had strangled French maritime trade, crushing their customs receipts and causing severe food shortages and bread riots across the country.
French Finance Minister Michel was repeatedly warning King Louis XV that the state's financial system was days away from disintegrating.
Britain is not in a much better position. They are suffocating under the enormous national debt incurred by paying subsidies to their continental allies. Furthermore, they had been forced to deal with severe domestic unrest, the Jacobite Rising of 1745, which required them to pull desperately needed troops out of Flanders to defend London from a rebel army.
And the Dutch Republic faced its own existential crisis. The French army had invaded Dutch Flanders, easily capturing and dismantling the supposedly impregnable Dutch barrier fortresses. This invasion sparked a political revolution within the Republic, elevating William IV to the position of stadtholder.
But the strategic damage was permanent. The dismantling of those fortresses definitively marked the end of the Dutch Republic as a great European military power.
So the exhausted diplomats gathered at Aix-la-Chapelle, and they proceed to swap conquered territories back and forth as if they are trading playing cards. France, despite having conquered the Austrian Netherlands at an enormous cost in blood and treasure, simply agrees to return the entire territory to Maria Theresa.
This decision was utterly baffling to the French public. They had fought for 8 years, won major battles, captured territory, and then the king gave it all back for almost nothing in return, aside from securing the minor Duchy of Parma for his Spanish allies.
The lack of tangible benefits for France led to widespread anger and a popular phrase circulating in the cafes of Paris: as stupid as the peace.
Meanwhile, Britain agrees to return the captured fortress of Louisbourg to France. This decision absolutely infuriated the British colonists in North America. They had organized the expedition, shed their own blood to capture it, and eliminated a major threat to their security.
And London simply gave it back. Why? Because in exchange for returning Louisbourg, Britain got the city of Madras in India returned to them by the French.
It was a stark imperial calculation. The British government prioritized the incredibly lucrative commercial assets of the East India Company over the physical security of their North American colonies. This betrayal sowed early seeds of deep resentment between the American colonists and the British crown.
And what about the original spark of the war? What about Prussia and Austria? The entire conflict started over Frederick seizing Silesia.
The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle formally confirmed that Prussia would keep Silesia. The single clause permanently doubled the population and economic output of Prussia, cementing its status as a newly minted major European power. But it left a deeply toxic legacy.
Maria Theresa is furious. She feels betrayed by her allies.
She was profoundly resentful of the British. She felt that Britain had applied immense financial and diplomatic pressure on her to cede Silesia to Frederick, simply to secure a quick peace that favored British imperial interests, entirely ignoring the fact that Austria had borne the brunt of the continental fighting.
And the British, conversely, feel that Austria is ungrateful. They pumped millions of pounds into the Austrian military, and they feel Maria Theresa did not do enough to fight the French, choosing instead to focus obsessively on fighting Prussia.
The result is that every single signatory viewed the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle not as a permanent resolution, but as a temporary armistice, a chance to reload. The lingering resentments over the terms of this treaty led directly to a massive geopolitical realignment known as the Diplomatic Revolution of 1756.
Britain abandons its traditional alliance with Austria to ally with Prussia, and Austria does the unthinkable allying with its historic, centuries-old enemy, France.
It's a stunning conclusion. A war that ignites over a legal document, a contested inheritance in Central Europe, engulfs the entire world. And the resulting peace treaty solves absolutely none of the underlying tensions. It merely sets the stage for the 7 Years' War, an even larger, more devastating global conflict.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. The War of the Austrian Succession proves that when global empires clash over a single, isolated issue like who has the legal right to inherit a throne in Vienna, the resulting peace rarely addresses the root causes. It often just rearranges the board.
The great powers traded fortresses in Canada for ports in India, completely ignoring the people who lived and died there, prioritizing the abstract balance of imperial power over actual stability. It is a dynamic of geopolitical horse trading, where local populations are used as poker chips, that feels highly relevant to how global powers operate today.
When you look back at that convoluted family trust we started with, the patriarch changing the rules mid-game, the reality is that no one actually cared about the rules. They only cared about what resources they could extract when the patriarch died.
And the resulting lawsuit was fought with armies, sieges, and naval blockades across 3 continents. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.